There is absolutely a healthy dose of masochism in there and stubbornness and pride and ego to push through. I did have for myself some certain lines that I knew just like if I hit a certain point emotionally or physically that I knew that I would need to stop and I would need to pull away. Hearing from the community and from staff consistently, like the things that they loved about this organization and the deep care and passion they had around it, you know, makes you want to fight for it too, and makes you believe that if you can get through, you can get through. There were times where I didn't necessarily feel like I was doing much more than trying to stand in one place and be a little bit of an anchor for people. And it was like, if I can stand here long enough while the waves wash over me, then, eventually the tide will go down and the storm will pass and it'll be okay.
Hi, friends. Ever wondered how you could turn your big ideas into results? Together, let's reimagine a better sector, tackle systemic issues, and yes, raise some serious cash. Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Welcome to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Today I have a guest that you might have already heard of before because she was in a previous episode of the Small Nonprofit. It is Nina. Hi, Nina.
Hi, Maria.
Nina, for someone who didn't catch the last episode, maybe they don't know what you do, can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Nina Horvath, and I am the executive director of the Coastal Jazz and Blues Society in Vancouver, BC. And our main activity is that we produce the annual Vancouver International Jazz Festival.
I am super excited to have this conversation because in the last episode, we talked a little bit about how we worked together through fractional fundraising. I want to talk about something that I was really impressed by when we first started working together. So just hearing kind of the turbulence that the organization had been through and how the staff felt you had led the organization through it, I felt was unique. Not many executive directors make it all the way through the crisis. Not many take it on. So I just think it'd be really interesting for you to share your perspective with our audience. So to start, tell us a little bit about what the crisis was.
Sure. So I started with Coastal Jazz in November 2021. In my research, as I applied for the job, I knew there were some potential challenges with some staff moving on, and I had identified a couple of things. For example, at the time, the board was entirely made of men, and I was like, oh, okay, we're going to change that. We're going to make this more diverse. So there were a couple of things that I had learned about, but what I learned once I started with the organization was that was really the tip of the iceberg. And I think there was maybe more going on than people even fully realized. So 2 weeks after I started in the job, they had their AGM. And it ended up being a highly contentious AGM. This was still in COVID times, so the whole thing was only on Zoom online. And essentially what happened in the AGM is that members of the community came and really firmly demanded some accountability from the current board members about some of the decision making that had been happening recently, in particular in regards to some HR decisions that had been made. And things got pretty heated and defensive and uncomfortable. And by the end of the meeting, what seemed to have happened is that either all of the current board members had either chosen to resign within the course of the meeting or had been voted out. What then unfurled after this was a lot of contention around the contentious AGM in terms of how things had proceeded, whether proceedings were legal, whether they were not. And this was really the kickoff to realizing that there had been a lot of challenges building up in the organization. And, it took us sort of the next 6 months to resolve all of that. A lot of the sort of like emotional pain that caused for people took much longer to resolve. And I think maybe if you ask some people, they still would not be happy with how things resolved in the end with that. And it was a really difficult time for the organization. It ultimately resulted in a complete turnover of the board. It also resulted in several senior staff either choosing to leave or being forced out of the organization by some of the decisions that had been put into place before I got there. And as a brand new leader to the organization, I had to figure out how to navigate all of this.
I'm, like, shuddering just thinking about it.
It was a very difficult time, and it was very difficult to come into such a complex situation with a lot of very different viewpoints on what was the best path for the organization. And, it was very difficult to come into that and having people come from all different sides of the equation to you and telling you their story and a lot of emotions and trying to understand where was the best path and what was the truth lying in the middle of everybody's perspectives, and coupled with the fact of a fair amount of fear for myself too and the job that I had just stepped into.
So there's a crisis, like, in the house, there's a whole board turnover, then you also have the reason why that happened is because community members were putting pressure on the board and came to the AGM, so there's, like, some external disgruntlement as well. How did you, like, digest all of that as it was happening? Did you take a break? I know you had just started. Wait, what did that look like to start?
There were no breaks. It was a lot of listening for myself too. I think there's still for me a lot of introspection and looking back at those times and questioning, did I do the right thing? Should I have acted more aggressively? It's hard to know. I certainly remember feeling a little frozen in the first couple months of being there and just being overwhelmed by information by people. There were some time sensitive issues there. So there was a lot of pressure to make choices and decisions, and having a really difficult time knowing how to balance what the community wanted, what seemed to be the best for the organization, and being stressed about that too, because, it's, oh gosh, I just started at this organization and now I'm being asked to steward it and understand what's the best move for it, where I feel like I'm still picking up some of the puzzle pieces of this. So I don't even have the full picture really to look at. And then, of course, there were some personal interests and needs and desires in there. And it was a bit impossible, I think, to balance everything to some extent, which was very hard. As somebody who is still a recovering people pleaser, it was very hard to balance that with also like staying true to myself and my values and knowing what was the best path for the organization. And again, who knows? I'm sure some people think that I didn't necessarily find that.
When it got there, like, all the staff did say, like, it was a complete horrible time, and then Nina's leadership, like, got us through, and, like, I really respect Nina, and those were, like, anonymous conversations,
Right.
so I think most of them are very happy. But I kinda wanted to ask you, like, what do you think were the main things that got you from, like, crisis at the organization to staff telling a random consultant, "No, it's not that bad, it's actually pretty good."
Yeah. Oof. Um, I think one of the things that emerged through that whole process was learning that there were a lot of people who had a lot of intense love for the organization. And in some respects, I think that whole crisis even started in a way because people really are passionate about the organization, but their opinions on what was best for it had really diverged quite severely. So that caused a lot of that rift between especially the community and the board. And the community certainly felt that the board wasn't making the best decisions for the organization in that moment. And we're really coming to that AGM to demand answers and to understand what the plan was and to demand transparency, because that had really eroded over the past while. So, when I came in, I think we grew to a point where staff trusted me, but that wasn't immediate. Certainly, I know for the first couple months, I think it was difficult for staff to understand. There was a lot of feeling of whose side are you on? Because the board hired you. So are you planted here by this board that we don't agree with? Or like you here to protect us as staff? And I really also was really trying to be very agnostic at the beginning and not necessarily sit on a side. And I think that was maybe, again, I don't know if I would have done that necessarily another time through, but I was also somewhat selfishly trying to protect my own interests and my own job at the same time too.
That's a very real consideration.
But I mean, in terms of like how we were able to move through it as staff, I think, again, I really value and prioritize transparency in all organizations, but it's certainly when you're in organizations of this size where, you know, the separation between who a staff member is and a volunteer or a board member is and a community member and a musician is there isn't really separation. Everybody is interwoven and it's a very tightly knit ecosystem. And so I think when you try to go into that kind of an environment with closed doors, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. People want to know. And it's also, I think it's very foolish to assume that information will always be kept confidential. Maybe people might think that's a contentious thing to say, but I know the musician community and I know that we all talk to one another. And I think it's not reasonable to think that won't happen. So my approach is that it's much better to just be as open as possible all the time. And to also conduct yourself in a way where you are completely comfortable with talking about any decision that you're making within reason. Of course, like there's some HR things, obviously, that always need to be confidential. But in terms of organizational choices, I think it needs to be super open. So, as an example, like when I came into the organization, I think they were doing staff meetings maybe every couple of weeks. And it was staff meetings with only like program heads or senior staff. So, not the entire staff weren't present all the time. And that was something that I shifted. We started doing staff meetings with everybody present and doing them weekly because there was a lot. And, and also like I needed to build trust with people too as an ED. And again, it evolved. Like in the beginning, I was more circumspect, I would say, in terms of what information I was sharing or not sharing. But I also just really didn't know. I didn't even know what I was allowed to talk about or wasn't allowed to talk about. And as we went further down that road and we started building more trust between one another, I think I started being a little bit more open about talking through what was going on with staff. And I think that certainly helped. I mean, it definitely, yeah, it was not immediate. I think it took us months of coming to a point where everybody was able to regain trust with one another. And it took months of also, just putting in the work and showing that you cared and showing what your values were or my values were. As we went forward after, so, it took us from November to April to move towards a full transition into we built a transition board, which had 2 members from the previous board and 2 members from the community. And then we added a couple more members as the year went on. So it was a very small transition board to start. And one of the first things that we committed to with that transition board was also holding quarterly town halls for any society members or any members who were from the community who wanted to come. So we started holding those on Zoom. I think we had the first one maybe in May of 2022. And that was also important for us to do as well, because we wanted to be able to come to the community regularly and say, this is what we're doing. Do you have questions about what we're doing? Do you have feedback? Do you have things you want to bring to us? We want to ask you your opinion on something and get, a sense of how you feel about things. And we've continued to do those. And I think that also has been very helpful from a community side as well, to show that we are turning over a new leaf on this. We are open to chatting with you guys. We're open to sharing information. We're here for you. We're accessible to you. I think that was valuable as well.
That sounds like a really helpful way to try to repair the harm, to just build the trust, build the accountability, and also create these feedback loops of what do you think about the things that we've done? What do you want to continue to see? And just create that ownership amongst everybody.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a fluctuating number of people who come to those and different members. It's interesting that it's not even necessarily the same members of the community every time. It's swaps around quite a bit. And yeah, I think it's been really good. And even just from a personal standpoint, I have liked it because it's let me come to learn the community better as well. There's a lot of crossover between community members and people who are also musicians in the area. It lets me get to know them better, which is great.
Let's go back to the transition board for a second. We had this board that was helping during the whole rollover chaotic time. Was it hard to then recruit new permanent board members? Did you have to explain any of what had already gone on? What did that look like?
We definitely did have to explain some of what had happened. It wasn't actually super difficult to recruit new board members. And I think we were fairly clear in terms of some of the values that we wanted from those. And we did do some kind of direct recruiting or direct asks of people in the community who we knew might be interested. There were 4 members. I think we added 2 kind of within the year, and then we added 1 maybe or 2 at the next AGM. So it was a small board of around 7 people. And that was somewhat deliberate too, is that at the beginning, for sure, we found it easier to have a smaller board and to keep communication lines open and to manage things at that stage.
Did you have any donors approach you and asking about anything?
Yeah, we did for sure. Granting bodies and funders. We had to have meetings with all of our major funders as this whole process was going on to explain to them what was happening. And certainly from an outside lens for them, they're like, oh gosh, new ED, big board challenges, it's a lot of destabilizing things. So I think they for sure wanted to have some reassurance of how we were going to navigate through this responsibly to varying different degrees. I'm proud to say like all of our funders stayed with us and we didn't lose any funding through this as well. And I think we were able to maintain those relationships. I think it probably certainly helped that while I was new to the organization, I was not new to the sector. So I knew some of those grant funders already and I knew the representatives already. So they knew me from my previous job. So I think they recognized who I was as a person and my ability to hold the organization together. That probably helped. I'm trying to remember how, like, in terms of donors, and again, for us, the way that we run our society is that anybody who donates to the society is considered a member. So in that sense, certainly we had a lot of questions from donors.
Okay, so you said a little bit earlier about there are some things that you might do differently if you had to do it again. I am 1,000% sure there's people who are going through chaos at their organizations of some level. So I've seen fraud. I've seen, oof, I'm sure people are listening and they're like, what would you have done differently? Like, how can they avoid any kind of missteps or anything that you think would have been different?
Yeah, when I was going through this and seeking advice from other people, it was validating, but also upsetting how many people I went to and were like, oh, your organization too? So it certainly is not an unusual thing to happen to organizations. As I said, like I felt quite insecure in my position in the first 2 months, 2, 3 months. And so as a result was maybe not as definitive with decision making as I would have been. And I think was maybe a little scared to listen to my gut instincts about things at the beginning. And I wanted to wait to get more information and to understand. And if I were to do it again, I would have had more confidence in my own instincts around things and in my own leadership skills. So I think I would have acted maybe more quickly around some certain things. But, I think what was helpful for me was at the same time that I say that, it certainly was helpful to listen to as many people as I could. Absolutely get outside perspective for what you're going through. As we're saying here, you're not alone in this. There's a lot of organizations who have traveled through these challenges. So if you can find people who have experienced this before you and just ask them for a quick call or something like that, I think that's very helpful to get some external advice and to also just have somebody who's gone through what you've gone through and that you can vent to is really helpful. I think you do have to trust yourself and your own values and be guided also by what the organization's values are and really grounding in that too.
When you were in the thick of it, how did you know, like, there is a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah.
Like, don't quit now because, like, I can get through. How would someone know, like, it's time to leave versus, like, you can actually pull through?
Yeah, I certainly wavered in that as I went through it. And I think if you were to ask some of our other staff too, I think they did as well. There is absolutely a healthy dose of just some masochism in there and stubbornness and pride and ego to push through. I did have for myself some certain lines that I knew just like if I hit a certain point emotionally or physically that I knew that I would need to stop and I would need to pull away. I think it was like hearing from the community and from staff consistently like the things that they loved about this organization and the deep care and passion they had around it makes you want to fight for it too, and makes you believe that if you can get through, you can get through. And I think for me, like, it's also a lot about trusting in people too. Like, there were times where I didn't necessarily feel like I was doing much more than trying to stand in one place and be a little bit of an anchor for people. And it was like, if I can stand here long enough while the waves wash over me, then, eventually the tide will go down and the storm will pass and it'll be okay. So yeah, there were times where I really felt like I actually wasn't doing a lot aside from just being like, I'm here. And you have to know, again, like knowing that so many organizations have gone through this before, like it does pass. And you do have to have a perspective too that, yeah, put yourself in perspective with the rest of the world and everything that's going on in it. And remember, it is awful in the moment. Don't get me wrong. And like the personal effects it has on people are awful, but we're still at the heart. We're a jazz organization supporting jazz music. Like you just need to have a bit of perspective sometimes too.
I feel like a lot of EDs don't actually talk about this very openly. It's usually of the staff who are like, "Did you see that the whole board turned over?" or something like that. Like they'll tell other people, but it's still not a very widely discussed topic. Like when there's a huge crisis, like people feel like, "Oh, I have a deficit and I can't talk to anyone about it," or "I just found out my employee was doing something that they shouldn't have and I can't talk to anyone about it." So I'm just wondering, like, why do EDs not talk about it? Is there some fear about their own roles or the perception of your organization, or what's your take?
I think it's both of those things. There's fear, certainly, that it's going to affect how funders view you and especially how donors will view you. I think it probably has affected us to a certain extent, also, in terms of maybe it took some time for some donors to come back and trust us with their support. Sometimes it's hard to know because you just don't hear from those voices and you don't necessarily know why you don't hear from them anymore. But yeah, I think you are scared of the public perception and the impact it will have on the organization. We also we have corporate partners and sponsors as well, who didn't necessarily want to be too transparent about being messy for a while there because you want people to continue to fund you and to continue to have faith in your organization and its ability to put on a professional level event. So I think there's that fear. And I think certainly there's the fear of how it's going to impact you as an individual and your reputation. It's a pretty small world, like the nonprofit world. I was unique in the fact that I had the advantage in a sense of coming into the crisis. It was a little bit of a different stance to be in because I could say okay, I didn't do this to the organization. But if you've been there for a longer time, then I think there absolutely can be a level of guilt or worry that you're like, oh my gosh, did I screw this up? Is this my fault? And of course you don't want to necessarily share that with people. I mean, even for me, you think about, and I was maybe part of the stubbornness of staying too, actually. If I quit now, what do I put on my resume to be like, oh, I was the ED that sank this ship? Nobody wants to put that on their resume. You want to say that you led the organization to new heights and new financial goals, etc. And maybe you feel isolated, right? It's easy to end up feeling isolated. And certainly if you are in those crises sometimes too, in the way that other people can act around you, could maybe also deliberately make you feel isolated. And yeah, I guess I was lucky in that sense, maybe that I had some good supports around me and maybe I was less worried to ask for support because I came in at the time that I did.
But if you had been the leader that screwed something up, do you think that process would have been different?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that. It's a little hard to know, honestly, how I would react in that moment. I'd like to think that I wouldn't. And it's hard to know because again, my whole values are very deeply rooted in openness and transparency. So it's a little hard to imagine being in that spot where I would start to conceal a lot of things. But I think it certainly, from an emotional standpoint, would be a lot harder to make that turnaround and to say, okay, yeah, I just have to own this and say I screwed up. But also, I think I would remind people that chances are, if you were in this situation, I would bet money that it's not something that is entirely on your shoulders, right? It's going to be a systemic matter that has come from many different challenges within your organization, within the environment at large. So also be careful that you're not trying to martyr yourself and take all the blame for something, because I have a hard time imagining that would be the case.
I've seen that too, where the ED is apologizing for things that happened 10 years ago because it was never addressed, and now they're the ED because of COVID, and now what? everybody is looking to you and your hands aren't clean, 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 but you're not responsible for 10 years worth of garbage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are more understanding potentially than you think too. If you can come into something with openness and honesty and be like, I need your help. I'm not sure how we got here. Or like I messed up. And now, people care probably about your organization and don't want to see it fail. Same with funders or donors and everything. Like nobody out there wants to see you fail. So I think that's also important to remember is that like everybody actually wants to help.
If you could give any advice to someone who's going through this right now, or maybe to like past Nina, what would you say? Run. No, kidding.
I've been asked that question many times about, oh my gosh, like, why didn't you just leave? And I still don't entirely know, mostly just because I'm very stubborn. I personally have challenges sometimes is that I can try to hold everything myself because I don't want to overburden other people, especially if I know that they're already stressed out and already trying really hard and have already gone through a lot of things. I'll just try and keep all of that within me instead. And that can be dangerous. And that for me, maybe as a person is like my area of growth is to be able to open that up to people more and to ask for help earlier and to trust in that. So I think potentially that, I did have people who I was able to ask for advice for, but I think I would have potentially opened up to staff earlier than I did.
I think leading with vulnerability can really go a long way when it comes to creating psychological safety for others.
That's very hard as a woman in leadership. It can potentially be one of our greatest strengths, but it's also scary because you are taught for a long time that like that's actually a weakness as a woman, that you shouldn't be too emotional, that you shouldn't be vulnerable, that you need to be strong. You can actively fight against that. And, trusting in those instincts I spent a lot of time questioning because you think, oh, this is my first instinct of what I should do with this. But then you're like, oh, but like maybe I'm supposed to be tough and whatever it is. Maybe I'm supposed to be this thing. Maybe this is how I'm supposed to act in this situation. I think you have to stay true and authentic to yourself. This is somewhat backed up also because I have it right here on my wall next to me. Some points from Adrienne Marie Brown, and that point around move at the speed of trust was such a huge part for me to the point that I printed it off and it's been on my wall since there. Move at the speed of trust and also the idea that change is constant and that you need to trust people. Like those sort of three kind of points. I look at those all the time and remind myself because I think they're incredibly important.
Nina, where can people find you if they want to continue the conversation?
Yeah, definitely. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to chat through this or give support. The best way to find me is on LinkedIn. My name's Nina Horvath. And yeah, check me out.
Thank you again for telling us so openly about what you've been through. I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this will have either gone through it and be thinking about how they're processing what happened to them or what they did. I think this will be really helpful. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. I know that you got a lot out of it, so go show Nina some love for our sharing. And if you want to see our lovely faces, as always, this will be on the YouTube channel. So thank you so much for listening. That's it for today. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.